Hello and welcome to Telegraph Studio and Business Reporter's Transforming Tax campaign, hosted by the Telegraph Online. I'm Alistair Green and today I'm talking to Kid Misso from Avalara. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, the government is promoting this digital tax agenda. So very soon, all businesses, self-employed people, property owners and so on are going to be having to file their accounts in a very different way. It's going to be digital. There's a lot to think about and a lot of change involved in that. So how prepared are businesses in the UK for this change?
In my experience, then they're not at all well prepared and are really going to struggle with the transition to a more digital approach. And I think there's really two reasons for that. The first reason is that the systems that they have in place are really not designed with these types of approaches in mind. They're often much more summarised information, not nearly so transactional. The users have to work around those issues, which kind of leads on to the second problem, which is they're just not trained to do that. They don't have the experience, they don't understand the upcoming changes, and that's going to leave them with real challenges as these roll on.
And let's look at individual companies, especially on the medium-sized level. What sort of challenges are they particularly going to have with trying to get this right?
Okay, larger organisations are going to have a number of challenges over small ones, and that's really related to the fact that they typically will have more complicated business models. They will often have more systems to consider. But I think the really primary reason they're going to struggle is because those organisations are typically in more than one country. And when you start thinking about VAT, more countries equals more complexity. It gets exponentially harder when you start doing business in multiple countries. One of the key reasons is really that although VAT is governed at a directive level across Europe, it is legislated for an individual country level. That legislation is typically only provided in the local language, and there are 21 languages across the EU. I don't know too many people that speak 21 languages, so that's a huge challenge. The tax offices in each of those countries typically will have their own approaches, their own processes that they want people to adhere to, and it's very difficult to stay up to date with all of the changes that these tax authorities are bringing in. So those are I think the primary challenges that they're going to have. That gets compounded by the fact that a lot of larger organisations, in their search for efficiency, will be looking to bring these processes together in shared service or central functions, often in a low-cost location, somewhere like India or maybe Eastern Europe. And the challenge with that is the people that work in those centres can be good finance people, but they are generalists and they're not experts in the individual countries. They typically won't speak the language. They don't know how to speak to the tax office when things go wrong. And that presents an efficiency challenge for those types of organisations.
Staying with the theme of efficiency, how do you think digitisation is going to help organisations? And maybe you've got an example of it in action.
There's a mass of spreadsheets out there that people are dealing with. And VAT directors, savvy people, they know that this isn't ideal. And most of them have been looking for some years to be able to implement more effective automation solutions. But they've never quite been able to convince the business that it's the time to go. Whereas when digitisation initiatives come along, we're faced with a situation that just can't be fixed with spreadsheets and brute force manual work. They have an opportunity to trigger a catalyst within their organisation where they can go to the business and say, we have to deal with this through technology and automation. And I think we've really noticed that at Avalara. Over the last few months, there have been a lot of changes and a huge uptick in demand as a result of that.
As you said, countries do things very, very differently. So if life wasn't complicated enough already, we're now bringing in digitisation. Why make it so much more difficult?
Well, the main reason for that is that most governments across the European region have serious deficit issues. If you look at last year, it's estimated that 160 billion euros of VAT gap. Now, the VAT gap is the difference between what the expected VAT revenue will be and what was actually collected, and it's 160 billion is gap. And so governments are forced to do something about that. And if you look at every manifesto that's been published for our general election, you'll see that there are measures in the manifestos to try and address some of that gap. What they're doing is looking to countries who have been successful in that respect in the past. And Brazil have actually been doing this since 2005. They have a mechanism where you For every invoice that you issue to your customer, you have to send it to the tax office electronically first, and they'll come back with a number that you have to print onto your invoice. So they're cleverly collecting all of the information up front that they will then marry to the returns that you submit. And a bit closer to home, we're seeing the first implementations of that in Europe as well. On the 1st of July this year, Spain are going to have a process where within 4 days of receipt or issuance of an invoice, you need to electronically provide those invoices up to the tax authority. And they're just really the first of a number of countries that are going to be doing that across Europe, with potentially with Italy coming next, potentially France and Hungary as well, all within the next 6 months. So a real change as far as the approach taken.
So a lot of change when it comes to digitisation and just systems generally. So let's say an organisation recognises that they need help and they come to Avalara. Tell us what you actually help them with and what the process is.
Yeah, so I think there are two real things that we can provide to our customers. The first is software which is designed and dedicated for the purpose of VAT determination and VAT compliance. In other words, working out what VAT there should be on a transaction, but also working out how to automate the process of doing that transaction with the tax authority as well. And then the second thing is expertise, and there are really two dimensions to that expertise. The software on its own is no good without the rules associated with all of the different countries, which are continuously changing. So we call that content. We have a tax research team who are specialists in all the countries, and they continuously monitor those jurisdictions and make sure that the content is right in the software so it's going to work properly throughout the life of an organisation's compliance process. But then it's also the expertise to know how to implement the software properly and the change management so that people can adapt to being able to use the applications correctly for them.
When we look at the tax changes, that's just one of the things that a finance department is going to have to deal with. And we know the changes at the moment, but what about round the corner? You know, you've talked about how you're prepared for what you can see, but let's look beyond that. What do you think are the other trends? What other sort of changes are out there, say in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think there's really a sea change in the way organisations are going to have to comply with legislation worldwide. The trend is very much away from the old-fashioned way of doing things, which was really about summarised information, it was about periodic returns, and it was about self-assessment. And now we're moving much more towards transactional information. Every sales and purchase invoice you have has now got to be reported in many places. It's also about much higher frequency information as well, sometimes real-time transactions and sometimes maybe daily transactions to tax authorities. So they have information up ahead about the transactions that you're going to do. And then also, in some jurisdictions, the notion of the government being involved in assessing the VAT that's due as well, not leaving that to the taxpayer. And that can present all sorts of complexities as well. But then I think we also look at a sort of more geopolitical picture. So take Brexit, for example. I think one of the initial issues there is that the government is going to have more freedom to set their policy around how VAT is applied and used. One of the initial sort of political areas that will definitely unfold is the application of more reduced rates. So things like the passy tax, things like tampon tax, they're very political and they're very likely to see reduced rates applied. And that's quite contagious because it's populist and we'll see that happen, I think, much more widespread outside of the UK, catching on across Europe and across the world a bit more as well. And all of these things just indicate change, they indicate complexity, they indicate having to stay up to date with a changing world. And I think that's what we'll expect to see over the next 5-10 years.
And one of the things in the changing world is going to be technology. We've talked about digitisation and all those things, but of course technology goes alongside hand in hand. So what are the things that organisations are going to need to be prepared for when it comes to technology?
Tax and finance are really waking up to the opportunities being presented by the technology that's available to them, and specifically cloud-based technologies that can be quickly deployed, that they don't have to install in their own premises, around automation for particular niche tasks. I think we're quite used to that in our personal lives. For example, if you want an app to control your central heating, that's something you'd be familiar with getting. And now I think organisations are familiar with going out to the cloud and getting applications like tax compliance from cloud-based vendors. So I think that's going to change things. I think there's another technology very close as well, which is called robotic process automation. And this is a tool where you can give it a set of instructions and it can learn a routine. So some more mundane and operational accounting tasks, like perhaps booking an invoice into a system, you code it to learn the way of typing the invoice into the system, and then it goes away and it does it 24/7 and in a consistent fashion. So those are kind of things that will affect accounting and finance, but I think there's broader considerations from a technology perspective. I think the pervasiveness of e-commerce and technologies like additive manufacturing, which is sometimes called 3D printing, are going to really change how supply chains look for organisations. The traditional approach of having things manufactured in China and distributed 6 months later around the world is changing, and things are going to be generated much closer to the consumer. And that's going to change supply chains. They need to be able to understand how those things work. And I think one other technology I probably would touch on, which I think has the possibility or potential of really changing the way that all business is conducted, is blockchain. And blockchain is a public ledger on the internet which is secure and available to the trading community to access. And the way that we've been doing business for the last 2,000-3,000 years, where we exchange business documents, invoices and sales notes and things like that, has the potential to go away and be replaced by an online public ledger like blockchain. And I think that's going to really change how people use systems and processes going forwards. So it's a lot of change. It's very, very rapid as well. But I think for the enlightened tax and finance person, I think there are fantastic opportunities available to those people. This notion of removing the day-to-day mundane accounting activities that have held them back, and perhaps giving them access to much more insightful information, much closer to the time of decision, gives them the opportunity to maybe move finance to a more front office type decision-making role within large organisations.
As you say, a huge amount of change coming along, and you've given us a lot to think about today. But hopefully, if we do prepare, that change won't be quite as much of a shock as it could have been. It's been fascinating finding out more. Kid Misso from Avalara, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.